Good morning, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Weed Control in Fine Fescue Naturalized Areas, presented by PBI-Gordon and taught by Matt Elmore, Ph.D. My name is Lisa Wick. I'm the Senior Manager of E-Learning here at GCSAA and will be today's moderator. A couple of quick housekeeping notes before I turn things over to Matt. We are recording today's event. You'll receive access to that recording via follow-up email. We encourage you to ask questions as we go along. You can type those in the question answer box in your control panel. If your control panel has minimized, you'll see a narrow strip with an orange rectangle at the top. Click on that. That will open up the control panel where you can type in question answer. You can also access the handout that's available to you there. If you want to have your microphone or telephone unmuted, on that same little tab, you'll see a raise hand button, and you can click on that, and we can unmute you at an appropriate time, and you can ask your question. This webinar has been made available by PBI-Gordon and carries external education points. We will give you a code at the end of the webinar that you will use on GCSA's website to enter those points. We hope that you find today's webinar valuable. It's brought to us in partnership with PBI-Gordon with a full line of herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, growth regulators, and other products. PBI-Gordon Corporation is a national leader in the professional turf and ornamental management industry. We thank them for their support. Matt Elmore, Ph.D., is an extension specialist in weed science, turfgrass, landscapes, pastures, and forages at Rutgers University. He earned his bachelors at Penn State, master's and Ph.D. at the University of Tennessee. Elmore's research focuses on novel strategies to control weeds with fewer pesticide inputs and better understand the influence of management practices on weed competitiveness. He has taught both seminars and webinars for GCSAA. Please join me in welcoming today's presenter, Matt Elmore, Ph.D. Matt?
Thanks, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us this morning. I hope everybody's doing well. I am going to, I guess the slides are up, so I'll get started. I'm actually going to go ahead and turn my camera off. Nobody needs to see me. We're going to talk about weed control in fine fescue naturalized areas today. And this has not been a huge focus of my research program until maybe the last couple of years, and we've started to do a little bit of work in the area. I moved to New Jersey, I guess about 5 years ago now, and so when I got here, it was evident that I think for a lot of the turfgrass managers in the state, some newer weeds like goosegrass and false green kalinga, and some of those warm season weeds that are kind of moving north were a problem. So we focused a lot on that, and we still are working in that area. But the thing that I continued to hear was, well, especially on a lot of golf courses, these naturalized areas are a huge problem and are incredibly costly to manage, and we really don't have a lot of maybe evidence-based research practices to manage weeds in those areas. And I think that's still the case, but there are a few things we've done work in, and then some other things that others have done work in a lot more, and I'll talk about all of that today. So I hope, again, just sharing what I know, and happy to answer any questions you have. And I'm gonna see, I don't know why I can't, there's the slides. So there it is, okay. All right, I think I've got the keyboard now. So sometimes I tend to go through the end of the presentation quickly, but I do want to thank lots of people that helped out with this, both in terms of support, collaborations, and actually the ones doing the work. So we've actually gotten some funding from the USGA to do some of the work that you'll see today. And all these other groups have been major supporters of my research program over the last few years. And I've also got a great team of people here at Rutgers to do work with: Dan Tuck, Katie Deal, Brandon McNally, some undergraduate students. And then, one of the constant themes that's been great in New Jersey is we get a lot of support from superintendents in terms of advice in research, and also sites to host research. And so for the slides you'll see today, thanks to Chris Boyle, Tim Connolly, and Matt Castagna for their willingness to host some of our research trials. Really appreciate it. So again, we're talking about, the title said naturalized areas. I think, there's a debate about what we could actually call these areas. Another thing that I've heard them called is no-mow fine fescue areas. The naturalized area concept is pretty good. Native areas is another one. I mean, I guess the argument there is they're not really native. These grasses are obviously not native to the United States, these fine fescues. They might be naturalized. No-mow fine fescue is another one, but we do mow them once or twice a year. High grass areas is another one. I guess the point is it doesn't really matter what you call it. I think we all kind of know what we're talking about. And so these are essentially, non-turf grass landscapes, and that's the biggest thing to think about is the practices that we use to maintain these areas, I think, are a little bit different than what we typically use in a more traditional stand of turf grass. If we think about a green, tee, rough, or fairway. So what we're going to talk today about is weed management, and then we'll talk a little bit about actually trying to thin that fine fescue out and what are the pros and cons of that. But whenever I speak with superintendents, these are really the challenges in those areas, is how do I manage weeds that I don't necessarily have the same tools I do in my highly maintained stands of turf grass. Then the other common problem is, well, these things get so thick that nobody can play a ball out of them. And so they become, a hazard, maybe different from what we'd like. So those are some challenges. And so, what I think an ideal naturalized area is something like is pictured right here, right? It's fairly thin. There are some of those nice fescue seed heads in the summertime that give it that sort of texture and color contrast to the high maintenance areas. It's thin, so it is playable. If you threw a ball in there, you could find it probably, and you could even probably get a club on it and play a decent shot. And also, there are a few weeds in these areas. That would be the other thing. So, in my opinion, I guess I don't have a ton of data to support it, but just from what I've seen, this result is pretty expensive and also elusive in most soils. This concept I think is played out best in sandier soils, but most of us aren't links golf courses or sand soils, so we are trying to create something that maybe nature does not really want us to have, I think, in a lot of cases. So we'll talk about that. I think for a lot of us in more native kind of heavier soils with more silt and clay and organic matter, here's a realistic option, right? We've got a really nice stand of fescue. There aren't any weeds, but it's pretty dense, and it's going to be difficult to find that golf ball in there. Another realistic option is, probably for a lot of us, is we've got a thinner stand of grass, and what this plot here is actually, we've actually done some work looking at treatments that might thin out the fescue. So that treatment was applied here, and you can kind of see that relative to the surrounding turf. So we've got this thinner, more playable area of fescue that you can kind of see there. But what happens is, that's an opportunity for some of these weeds to invade. And we know nutsedge is a weed that really likes bare soil, lots of sunlight. It does really well in that type of environment, thin turf. So it sort of, invites a lot of these weed problems that maybe you wouldn't have if it was a very thick stand of turf grass. And I think, again, it all goes back to the soils. If you look in some of these soils, and this is the naturalized area with a very sandy soil, that's just what's naturally there. And this was how the area looked in mid-August, right? You can see a few things in this picture. On the top, you've got the fine fescue, and then you've also got lots of bare area in there, which isn't necessarily undesirable. You could play a golf shot out of there. So you've got these tufts of fine fescue, the bare soil, and you can see there actually are a couple weeds. You've got spurge and crabgrass. So these are summer annual weeds, and this is late August at this point. So, in a more rich soil, these things would have, sprawled out and taken over. But in this more nutrient poor soil, the fine fescues actually do fairly well, especially the hard fescues. And the weeds don't necessarily have this great competitive advantage that they would have if you had thin turf in a richer soil. So, that's why, again, this result can be fairly elusive. The other thing going on here is that, obviously no fertilizers applied, and that's pretty typical of these naturalized areas. And they also didn't have any fugitive irrigation. Borrow a term from Frank Rossi, but this would be irrigation from the highly maintained areas that is sort of, basically spilling over, or maybe a head's not adjusted right. So, extra irrigation that's going to, again, give a competitive advantage to the weeds in most cases. So those things are being managed for. So in a situation that's maybe more typical for a lot of us in the room, where we've got to rely on lots of different practices for weed control, what are the things we can do? We're going to talk about mowing. We're going to talk a little about limiting water and fertilizer, and also sand capping is a potential but maybe expensive strategy. Sand capping, I've seen it done in several places, typically when there's a bunker renovation project and they need to dispose of the extra sand. You might pick your naturalized areas that are most or closest to being in play and sand cap those with a few inches of sand. And that, again, have not done research on that, but that seems to help provide sort of that thin, wispy, fine fescue area without a lot of weed competition. I think a big one, and there is a little bit more research on this, is the fugitive water, and trying to, adjust those irrigation heads as much as possible to prevent any extra irrigation from landing in these naturalized areas. So here's an example on a golf course. You can see they've actually sand capped this naturalized area, and there's a fairway off to your left. And what you can notice, hopefully, is that there's a lot of field paspalum, which is similar to Dallas grass in this picture. That's a perennial warm season weed that really thrives in wet areas. So there's a lot of that. There's also a lot of nutsedge, and it's actually a little off color there. It was treated with an herbicide, but the point is we've got two weeds here that are indicators of wet soils, and those are thriving in this area. And so, in talking with the golf course superintendent, they said, well, yeah, we actually have an irrigation head that, makes its arc right through this naturalized area. So, those sorts of things really put you at a disadvantage when it comes to trying to manage weeds in these areas. We're already kind of limited on herbicide tools. A lot of times we may be limited in terms of herbicide competition, or turf competition. And then so trying to manage that water is really important, and try to keep the water out of there as much as possible. And I'd say the biggest thing that leads to not all, but a lot of the weed problems in these areas, and I think the biggest adjustment from going to a fine turf area to one of these high grass areas, is that the frequent mowing in those fine turf areas really maintains the early succession and keeps actually, selects a lot of the weeds out of the fine turf areas. So, a lot of the weeds you see in the high grass areas are selected out of those fine turf areas because of frequent mowing. They just don't survive. It's sort of like going from an agricultural crop field to a turf stand. The weeds that we see are completely different because, we're maintaining this early succession and basically killing a lot of these weeds by mowing. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and kind of going, but to the succession concept. Keep in mind that especially if you're on the East Coast, the climax community, if we were to not really do anything, to not mow over many years, what was here before humans got here basically was this climax community of trees and vegetation. And so what we essentially do when we disturb an area or till it or basically maintain it as a golf course is we sort of keep it in these sort of early successional phases. We artificially keep it in this phase. And so, very frequent mowing is likely to give rise to different species than infrequent mowing, which would give rise to different species than no mowing. So a lot of the tree saplings and things like that, especially that I know are problematic in these areas, are essentially the nature kind of wanting to go back to this climax, and we are trying to maintain it in a different state. So we're fighting that as well. And so we'll kind of talk about herbicide, a base herbicide program for a little bit. We'll talk about some of the problematic weeds and maybe some strategies to control them, and then we'll close after that. But essentially, the way I like to think about weed control in cool season grass is, in terms of life cycle. So I've got the months of the year on here, but this is obviously going to vary depending on where you are. So you might want to think of it more in terms of the growth rate of the cool season grass or the warm season weeds. So the growth rate of the cool season grass is obviously going to be rapid in the spring, and this isn't a perfect graph, but just to kind of get us all on the same page. Got rapid growth in the spring, right? And then these cool season grasses are going to struggle a little bit in the summer. The growth rate might slow, and especially relative to the warm season weeds. Then we get a little bit more growth in fall. This, you could draw this like that, for example. But the point is here, we've got, different times where we might want to think about targeting these weeds, especially, the warm season weeds, where we might want to target, in the shoulder seasons where they're a little bit weaker, and maybe not in the middle of the summer. And there's logistical reasons for that as well, especially in these high grass areas. So maybe what does a typical program look like in these areas? A lot of us are probably relying on pre-emergence herbicides for those applications in early spring. So we're applying a pre-emergence herbicide for annual weed control, right? Something like a dithiopyr or a prodiamine or a pendimethalin. And then once things get going a little bit more in the spring, we might have a broadleaf application, or we could even tank mix the pre-emergence herbicide in the broadleaf application. So that could potentially get you through the spring. A lot of times in the summer, you might be at this point, we're not driving large equipment into the areas for this broadleaf sedge application, but maybe what we're doing is we're spot treating with backpacks. And I add the sedge here because this is typically the time of year that sedge is going to start to emerge and become problematic. And in the fall, it's common to mow these areas. So there could be, this is kind of just a real cookie cutter kind of template thing. There's obviously lots of variations on that. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the weed targets, or some of the weeds that, especially in the northeastern United States, are problematic. If you've got other questions on some of the weeds, I'm happy to try to answer them. But these are the ones I want to talk primarily about today. We'll primarily talk about annual and perennial grasses. But you've got things like Canada thistle, poison ivy, woody plants, and then American burnweed is kind of a one that's been problematic in the last 10 to 15 years. There's the annual grasses. You've got stilt grass, you've got your foxtails, barnyard grass. And again, you notice things like crabgrass and goosegrass probably aren't going to be very problematic in these areas, just because of it's a different kind of environment. And then you've got perennial grasses like deer tongue and quackgrass, and then of course we've got nutsedge. So real quick on some of the broadleafs, I don't think I need to talk too much about identification of thistles, poison ivy, or some of the more woody plants that are in these areas. But again, I wanted to mention American burnweed because it's one I think that's pretty prevalent, but isn't always identified. And it's important to identify this one because it's a prolific seed producer. So on the left side of the screen, you've got the rosette stage. On the right side of the screen, you've got it in the reproductive stage, where it's just producing thousands of those windblown seeds that are then going to be next year's crop. So it's fairly easy to control with herbicides, and it also has a really weak root system, so it can easily be removed by hand in some of these areas. And so I'm kind of using that to segue into a transition about broadleaf weeds, and American burnweed is one. There's lots of others. Typically, in terms of, and this is a staple of many programs, a lot of the 3 ways are really economical. And I have that, I have some indicators here on which products are available in which regions. At least I tried to do my best. So there are, a lot of these 3 ways are examples of something that's available in Canada: 2,4-D, MCP, MCPA, dicamba, those sorts of things. Those are generally the most economical. In the United States, we also have Speed Zone, which works well. And then sometimes there are, auxin and fusilage / segment mixtures, but you want to be careful with those, and we'll talk more about that later. So again, really, we're looking at, in terms of economical, a lot of these three-way type products. And this will control a lot of the weeds in these areas. But, I think what a lot of times what we have problems with and what I get questions about are some of the weeds that maybe don't respond to these as much, things like poison ivy or some of the tree saplings, those sorts of things. And so sometimes, products with better efficacy might be necessary. And that would be better efficacy against certain weeds. There are certain weeds that if you're not controlling them with these typical standard three-way type products, trying to find a product that includes triclopyr, clopyralid, aminopyralid, or fluroxypyr are good options. Again, a lot of these tougher to control weeds will be better controlled by some of these active ingredients here. And so these have made their way into some of the newer products, like aminopyralid is contained within Native Clean, and then fluroxypyr is contained within SurePower. Again, there are lots of options out there, but I think the point is that if you're using a three-way product and you find there are some weeds that are slipping through, trying to get some information about whether one of these active ingredients might provide more efficacy would be important. And just again, I've got, for some of these, I know, the New York area and Long Island, some of you are on here. So products that are available in New York are indicated by that New York State logo. And then if it's available in New York and also Long Island, you'll see the LI there. All right. And so a lot of times too with broadleaf weeds, we think about pre-emergent herbicides because a lot of our standard pre-emergent herbicides like dithiopyr, prodiamine, and pendimethalin may have little efficacy on these broadleaf weeds. Those herbicides are actually more active on grasses than broadleaf weeds. They will control broadleaf weeds in many instances, but if you're in a situation where you've got a broadleaf annual weed, something like American burnweed, you could think about Gallery or isoxaben as an option for pre-emergence broadleaf weed control, but this might not be as economical as some of the post-emergence herbicides, so it just kind of depends on your situation. So with that, that's kind of the end of the broadleaf weed section, and we're about to move into the grassy and sedge weed control section. And so I wanted to ask a question on which weeds are most problematic for you at your facility. And I'll do my best to try to cover what's most problematic based on the results of this poll.
While they're voting, Matt, I'm just going to say there is a handout available. I know several people came in a little bit after the top of the hour. Welcome. You can download that handout from the GoToWebinar control panel if you'd like to do that. And closing the poll in. Well, they're still coming in, Matt.
Okay.
I'm impatient today. I've been running around like a crazy person today.
Yeah, your heart rate's still up a little bit after the power going out.
Trying to get that big garage door up.
Yeah.
Okay, now they're slowing. So here we go.
Okay, a lot of foxtail. Okay. Quackgrass, yeah. Alrighty. That helps.
Do I get to say about what's in my yard? No,
sure.
You didn't even want to know.
Is your yard a naturalized area?
Parts of it are a little bit, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
okay,
and
so
on the other, somebody typed in kikuyu grass and fine fescue.
Fine fescue. Wow, I don't have a lot of that. I guess it's supposed to be California, huh?
Yeah, Canadian thistle is another one we see.
Okay. Yeah, and so Canadian thistle is a good, that one, is going to respond a lot better to the clopyralids, the aminopyralids, the triclopyrs. And another key with that one is to make those applications when the plants are still in the rosette stage, excuse me. So it's a biennial. So when those plants are in the rosette stage, once they start to bolt and flower, then those herbicides become really ineffective because they just don't translocate to the perennial tissues. So I don't have a lot more on Canada thistle other than that, but I appreciate the questions because then I can.
There's another person who has put in black medic. I don't know what that
Okay.
is. White
Yeah.
clover
Okay.
and Russian olive.
Okay. Yeah, the olive. That one's tricky. And some of these, like especially the more bushy type things, if you can at all increase your mowing frequency, that can help. Maybe even selectively in some of these areas where some of these weeds are problematic. A lot of these, we kill a lot of weeds with just the annual mowing, but some of them might respond a little bit better to some more frequent mowing. I know that's not always practical, but you could potentially target it in some of those areas. And I think those other two were broadleaf weeds, black medic and I hit clover. Those typically respond a little bit better to the triclopyr, clopyralid type herbicides. So I'm not seeing any of the questions. I'm glad you are. All right,
Well,
so
they don't want you to lose your focus, so I'm the only one who can see them.
yeah.
All right, continue on, sir.
All righty, good deal. So this wasn't a big one on the poll, so I won't get into it too much. This is Japanese stilt grass. It is an annual weed, and I typically see this in shaded areas, and sometimes it's even along the kind of the edges of tree lines that maybe aren't naturalized areas. But I think the key to remember with this is that it's among the first summer annual weeds to germinate. So it germinates before crabgrass, and if we're timing our pre-emergence applications kind of around crabgrass or other summer annual weeds that emerge, we often miss it because the pre-herbicides are effective, but if you apply these herbicides after weed emergence, they're not going to work very well. So I have some slides just to show that real quick. For those that aren't familiar though, Japanese stilt grass is a big problem on the East Coast and central United States. Looks a lot like crabgrass, but most of the biotypes don't survive regular mowing, so we might see them in these naturalized areas. It looks a lot like crabgrass. There it is. Some differences are that sort of you can see how it doesn't really have a big prostrate growth habit. It's more upright. And then the other big thing is that the midrib here, which goes through the leaf, is actually always a little bit not right down the center. It's a little bit asymmetrical. You can see here it's sort of a little bit skewed to the left side of the leaf. And so that's a big giveaway for Japanese stilt grass. It's also really easy to pull out. If you're not familiar, you might want to look up some more pictures, but a big problem in unmowed areas. And here's the problem, right? So this is April 19th in this case, and this was actually right around the time that crabgrass germinated, a little bit before it actually in this particular year. And the stilt grass was already up, and we already had leaf stage stilt grass. So applications for stilt grass control, pre-emergence applications in most cases probably won't work. And that's really highlighted by this research here. We found that prodiamine applied, on that April 19th date there, and then evaluated in midsummer, really provided very poor control. Interestingly, dimension provided good control, but we know dimension to provide early post-emergence activity on crabgrass, so maybe that's not a huge surprise. Should mention that stilt grass is not on the label for either of these products, but we were just trying to generate some efficacy data. If barricade were applied true pre-emergence, it would have worked well. And then we also evaluated a combination of barricade and acclaim on Japanese stilt grass because acclaim or phenoxyprop is a post-emergence product, and I believe acclaim is available in Canada as well. So acclaim in this case of the barricade plus acclaim treatment is providing post-emergence activity on the stilt grass that has emerged, and then the prodiamine is providing that residual weed control against seedlings that might germinate later. And we used a fairly low rate of acclaim in this work because the seedlings were small. So there's the rate there, 9 ounces per acre. All right, and there's just some pictures of that. Again, not a big weed, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But there are some pictures from the plots. Okay, so I didn't have a lot on this, but it was a big problem that everyone indicated in the chat. So we'll try to talk a little bit more about it. So foxtail and barnyard grass, these are definitely problematic in these areas because for a couple reasons. One is that they are fairly large seeded, so they might not be as controlled by some of our standard pre-emergence herbicide programs. Another challenge is that they germinate a little later. And they also compete well in these real, unmowed areas. So a common strategy to provide better weed control in these areas is to apply a pre-emergence in fall and in winter, that November or December application, depends on where it is for your area. And then again in late April or May before those weeds might emerge. And there's a couple reasons for this. Essentially what we're trying to do is get more pre-emergence active ingredient into the soil so that we can get through the summer and maintain control of these weeds as they emerge from seed. And the reason you do it in the fall and winter and then again in late April and May is partly due to labeling restrictions sometimes to try to get that total amount of active ingredient up a little bit while, staying within the rules of the label. And this is, again, a little different from a typical split application program that you might use in a fine turf area, where you might apply in late April and May, and then again 4 to 6 weeks later. And that is a potential option in these areas, but usually by the time you get to June, these areas are grown out and you don't want to be driving equipment through them. So you need to take advantage of, that time between the last mowing and when they really start to grow again in the spring to make those applications. The other options, if you have escapes, are post-emergence weed control with products like Pilex, and quinclorac could potentially be an option as well, but you have to be careful a little bit and sort of work with it and find fescue, because the fine fescue tolerance to quinclorac is moderate. So that's something you'd want to gain some experience with in making that application. And then the other key is to scout where these areas are, where these weeds have been problematic in the past, and try to make applications before the weeds get too mature. Because once they get mature, regardless of the compound, the active ingredient, whether it's Pilex or quinclorac or even some of these graminicides like fluazafop and segment, once these weeds get large, they become very difficult to control. And so you kind of get behind the 8 ball, especially once you start to see seed head. So I guess if we've got other questions on that, I can definitely take them. Again, these are the, if we look at active ingredients, it's basically quinclorac, dipramazone, which is Pilex, fluazafop, which is Fusilade or Ornamec, and then Sethoxidum, which is Segment. And I'd actually have to look and see, kind of how those active ingredients rank in terms of efficacy. But I think the biggest thing is trying to get applications out early if you can. So I hope that helps a little bit. Another weed I want to talk about.
There is a comment here in the chat.
Yeah.
I missed Imprellis. It was outstanding in the natives, which we have about 100 acres worth. Last year we used Native Clean, which was pretty good.
Okay.
After 30 years of mowing, burning, and herbicides, much of the native areas are now converting to blue stem, switchgrass, and others.
Okay, yeah, good comment. It's a good mix of things to have in there too. Yeah, so aminocyclopyrachlor, which is was Imprellis, was very good. Chemically related to that, but definitely without a lot of the problems that Imprellis had is the Native Clean, the aminopyrrolidine Native Clean. Those are chemically somewhat similar, so that might be why you've had good results with that. I have not worked with Native Clean myself, but if you look at the active ingredients in there, it should be able to control some of those tougher to control species, and it would be safe to any grass, including some of the ones you mentioned. So appreciate the comment. Okay.
And then the other question that's here before we go on, would you apply a pre-emergent in November in Minnesota?
Well, yeah, you have to kind of base it on the time of year. And always with pre-emergence is always you kind of have to base it off of, what's worked in the past and what hasn't in terms of the overall active ingredient rate. And then you want to apply it before the soils are frozen. So it might be too late in Minnesota not entirely sure. As long as the soils are not frozen, then it's okay to make the application. You know, if you apply it and get some water, get it watered in by rainfall before the soils freeze, you should be okay. Definitely, you don't want to be applying these to frozen soils because they won't get into the soil and absorb before the winter sets in. So in terms of the total amount of active ingredient, you know, whether that late season application might work up there. I don't have experience up there, but typically I would, you know, if you're applying a certain amount of pre-emergent right now and feel like it's not working for you, potentially looking to increase that rate by the fall application strategy is, I think, where a lot of that has come from. A lot of the research with that winter application strategy has really been done in highly managed turf grass, you know, for things like crabgrass control, where they've looked at to try to see if, you know, if you can make an application in November or October and still get good crabgrass control the following spring. So there hasn't been a lot of work done with that in native areas, you know, specifically in these specific systems. So it's always tough for me to make recommendations. It's more of a philosophy that's been adapted from highly managed turfgrass systems. That's the challenge with a lot of, you know, with these areas in general, is I think the research is kind of behind the practice, I guess. So, but that's a good question. All right, I will go on and talk about deer tongue grass then. So at least I know in my region, this is a really problematic weed. It's a perennial grass that is actually native to the eastern United States, but it really doesn't, it's not really desirable in these naturalized native areas because it just doesn't have the characteristics of playability. It's used a lot for bank stabilization and that kind of thing, where you need vigorous growth. And it results in dense mats of thick rhizomes. And I've got some more pictures of it here, especially on the right side of the screen is showing you what it looks like in midsummer. Obviously, that's not going to be something that's desirable on a golf course. So, you know, as a perennial weed, how does this weed kind of go through the year? Well, it emerges in the spring from the rhizomes where it's overwintered, and then it starts to branch laterally in the spring, and those clumps get bigger and bigger. And then in the spring and also late summer, it has some flowering events. So in the spring, you see this pollinated, you know, cross-pollination seed head there, and so that has that. And then it also has another flowering event in late summer where there's another inflorescence or seed head that kind of stays within the stem, and so there's no crossing that occurs there, but you get a much higher percentage of seed that are viable. So the bottom line, what you need to know is that this weed is a perennial, but it also spreads via seed. It's not really known how competitive these plants are as seedlings, you know, how much they might move around the property from seed, or whether the stand really is reliant on a few plants to get established and then spread. But it is a perennial plant, so we got to think about that in terms of management. And then in the winter, it kind of goes dormant and usually gets mowed under. So deer tongue grass, I do mention this, it's not a huge problem yet, but it's becoming more of a problem, especially if you go from the mid-Atlantic up to like the Philadelphia area. Small carpet grass, or sometimes referred to as joint head anthraxin, which is pictured on the left side of the screen, looks a lot like deer tongue grass in terms of the way the leaf kind of interacts with the stem there. But the carpet grass will have a purple stem, whereas the deer tongue grass will not. And also you can see the difference in the seed head there. The thing to remember about the small carpet grass is that it's an annual weed, whereas the deer tongue grass is a perennial. So the management is completely different. Again, this is something we're seeing a little bit more in the mid-Atlantic. So what's been done, and what are the typical herbicide options that we think about for deer tongue grass control? I kind of mentioned this is a perennial weed, so we don't want to be looking at pre-emergence herbicides. The pre-herbicides might help if we've got a situation where you've got, you know, a lot of seed in the seed bank, but these plants year to year are mostly coming back from those perennial structures. I get a lot of questions about sulfentrazone products because if you apply a sulfentrazone-based product to these in the summertime, you will see some injury to the leaves. But if you look at the research that's been done, the sulfentrazone products are not as effective as some of the other options that are out there. Yes, it will provide some nice herbicide symptomology, but efficacy-wise, these 4 products here, and again, primarily these 3, for those of us in the United States, are going to be the most effective, and we'll talk about that. So to go through these real quick, Segment, which is cefoxidim, is safe in a lot of these, in fine fescue. We would never use this in regular, Kentucky bluegrasses or those sorts of things. Fusilade or fluazafop, which is also sold as Ornamec, is another option. And then Pilex, which might be an option, especially if you've got a lot of other kind of native grasses in there, is an option as well. So there's been some work done with these in the past, these herbicides, and this was done by Sean Askew at Virginia Tech. Essentially what he found is that, which is typical of perennial weeds, that 3 fusilade applications worked well in controlling this weed. That would be 3 applications over the course of the year at 24 ounces to the acre. Pilex worked well as also if multiple applications were made. And then additionally, glyphosate was very effective. This is potentially an option in fine fescue if you've got experience with it. But if we're looking at selective options, the Fusilade or Ornamec here, the Pilex are your typical selective options that have been evaluated. I would expect that Segment would be similar to Fusilade, but I don't believe, at least when I looked, I had not seen a lot of work done specifically on deer tongue grass. And to go over the labels here, you can just have this for reference, I think, for the sake of time, but these are sort of the application rates that we're looking at with Fusilade. There, the only thing to keep in mind is that the rates for Ornamec, which is also fluazafop, are going to be different. All right, so here's some work that we've done now in New Jersey. This started in 2020, actually. And so our thought was, okay, well, we know there are some good herbicide options out there, but you saw how, especially if we want to use fluazafop or Pilex, we're going to have to make multiple applications to control this weed. And so our question was, can we isolate a particularly effective application timing so that we could potentially make fewer applications? And that was sort of the idea behind this work here, looking at deer tongue grass control with both Fusilade 2 and glyphosate. So these were 2 separate treatments. And we evaluated these at different application timings in 2020. And so we evaluated this at 2 growing degree day based timings in the spring, 120 growing degree days and 270. I apologize, these numbers are kind of weird, but these are converted from Celsius, which was 75 and 175. So they're, again, I think somewhere in this range is what you'd be thinking about if you're a practitioner. But this was growing degree days based, not 32 degrees, but 50 degrees Fahrenheit starting the 1st of March. We also wanted to look at some kind of phenology-based timings, which is, I think, when a lot of the applications are made, at flowering, when the weed starts to look, fairly large and obnoxious, and then sometimes in midsummer is another common application timing. And we also wanted to evaluate a fall application timing because work has been done in the past to show that fall applications can work fairly well for some of these perennial weeds. So we looked at, once we started to get some cooling accumulation in the air, when the temperatures, basically when things started to cool off after the summer. So you've got the calendar dates there. And I think another thing to keep in mind, especially given that this research is fairly preliminary, is that how did the weed look at these different application timings? And I'll kind of give you a hint that, this timing here is one that you want to focus on, this 270 growing degree day or May timing. Once the weed had really started to grow a little bit, but the temperatures weren't so warm that it was midsummer. And this is actually a good time to get in there and get equipment in these areas and spray them a lot of times as well.
So what are the results? Before you go on,
yep.
Can you talk just a little bit about cooling degree days for those people that might not know, because
Yeah,
the first time I saw it, I thought it was a typo. And I know you did a webinar for us, but there may be a few people in the audience that don't know about that.
yeah, sure. So it is, I guess, a concept that several of us have been looking at for maybe a few years now, as a way to initiate fall application timings instead of just looking at the calendar. You know, what's some actual environmental triggers we can use for that? And so the idea is that we use 70 degrees Fahrenheit as a base. And so basically, anytime the temperature is under 70 degrees, that would be the average temperature for the day. So it's like growing degree days, but the opposite. You know, anytime that average temperature for the day is under 70 degrees, you get accumulated cooling degree days. So if the average temperature was 65, that would be 5 cooling degree days. And the idea is that, you know, we're trying to find a time when basically 70 degrees for a lot of warm season weeds is that average temperature is sort of a time where their metabolism starts to slow a little bit, and maybe they're more susceptible to some herbicide applications. So a lot of it was more based in warm season weeds, and so we C4 weeds, but we wanted to put it in here as a treatment for deer tongue grass. So does that give a good explanation?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. And yeah, so in terms of calculating these, there's not readily available calculators like there are for cooling degree days. So you could kind of use it as like a concept in terms of, okay, when you finally feel like you get over that hump of really hot temperatures in the summertime, you can start to breathe a little bit in terms of, worrying about putting surfaces. And that's a good time of year for that. And, this has worked in temperate climates. I don't know how it works in like sort of California climates where there's not as much of a seasonal swing in temperatures. So in terms of efficacy, you notice we did evaluate glyphosate in these, and there's been work to show that glyphosate fine fescues have tolerance to glyphosate. I'm not sure that I'm completely comfortable with glyphosate yet, and that's in these areas. It's something we're doing more work with this coming year, but we did want to put it in there because others have done work with it. There's some work that came out of Wisconsin and some work out of Virginia Tech to show that especially these hard fescues do have a pretty good bit of tolerance to glyphosate. So we found that if you average across all the growing degree day timings, and this is control in terms of weeks after treatment, we've got deer tongue control on the y-axis, so more control is better, higher numbers better, and this is weeks after treatment. So with perennial weeds, we want to look many weeks after treatment because they've got rhizomes and they have this ability to regenerate. So if you look a month after application, it can look a lot different than it does 4 months after application, for example, when those plants have had a chance to try to recover. So that's something to keep in mind. And again, this was averaged across all the different timings, but basically what this shows you is that fluazepop is effective, but glyphosate was actually a lot more effective in this work that we did. The other thing we looked at was timing. And so the key thing to keep in mind with the glyphosate, and we'll see the same thing with the fluazepop, is that this 75 growing degree day timing, that first timing in the spring, was not as effective as the other timings. And especially we've got good data at this point on the 175 growing degree day timing, and I didn't convert these, but that would be the second timing. And so that one worked well. And I think as in terms of, practically in these areas, we're making broadcast applications. This blue dot here is going to be our most practical, right? We can go back and look. That was the 270 degree day timing at the 26th of April is what we're looking at here. So that was much more effective than the early timings. The later timings, I think we still have to see how effective they're going to be because we're not a year out with some of these yet. So again, this is fairly preliminary, but I think our key finding was, waiting until temperatures get a little bit warm. In this case, we got 270 growing degree days from March 1 at a base 50. that was a good time to make that application. So again, too early is bad, but there is kind of a sweet spot in the spring, which I think is probably the most practical for a lot of us here. Flavizop, you can see, was not as effective, but it was most effective again at that application timing, that B application timing we've been talking about. So the take home from this is that, of course, especially for fluazepop, a single application is not going to be effective, and that's what we expected. But we wanted to try to isolate that most optimal application timing, which is again around 270, 300 growing degree days in mid-May. And so that would be a potential good place to start as a base for these programs, and then make subsequent applications upon regrowth. This is just a picture of the glyphosate plot here at that 175 base Celsius. So this would be 270 in the Fahrenheit units, but fairly effective, and I think it's something that showed a lot of promise, I guess. And we actually even had a decent amount of the forbs that recovered and came back into these plots, and not very much fine fescue injury, which is supported by previous research. You can see the deer tongue grass all around this plot here. So looking, at how to improve control with this weed, I think the biggest thing is to try to temper your expectations a little bit in terms of one application controlling it. But I think the key is here is this multiple applications throughout the season, even across multiple years, on 3 to 4 to 6 week intervals throughout the season. So maybe a broadcast application early in the year, and then spot applications if you can later in the year. And then applying, once we get good growth in the spring. Mowing these areas might help more as well, but we're not really sure about that yet. That's something we're going to look at this year. And quackgrass, I'll go through this quickly. A lot of the same strategies that we talked about with deer tongue apply to quackgrass in terms of multiple applications. We don't know a lot about the optimal application timings, but quackgrass and deer tongue grass are similar in that they emerge from rhizomes in the soil. The rhizome network of quackgrass, though, is much more extensive, and so that can make it more difficult to control. But in terms of herbicide options, phenoxaprop, which is available in Canada and is usually associated with these graminicides, your segment, your fusilade, Ornamex, is not going to be effective on quackgrass. So really you're limited to these options, and glyphosate works fairly well also. Again, this is a very difficult weed to control, probably more difficult than deer tongue grass. And I think, I just don't have a lot of research to share on it. There's definitely a need to do more, but if you wanted to start anywhere, it would be basically consistent applications using these products. All right, so we'll just
quick question here before you go too much further on the deer tongue. Yep. What was your glyphosate rate?
So yeah, that's a good question. I think I hate to make a recommendation because it'd be off-label. There's a lot more work that needs to be done.
You can't be doing off-label. Label is the law.
Yeah, so we use 32 ounces to the acre in our work. I believe I think I had it in there. So 32 ounces to the acre. This year we're going to do a lot more work looking at different rates and how does that affect the fine fescues and that kind of thing, to follow up on some of the work from Virginia Tech and Wisconsin. But I know a lot of superintendents have played around with glyphosate in these areas as well. So unfortunately, a lot of it's sort of just trial and error right now, I think. But because timing is, there's all sorts of different things. Timing relative to green up in the spring, rate. So there's, there are things that need to be figured out, I think. But good questions.
Do you have some type of recommendation on how to keep track of that? Like, do you use a particular spreadsheet or something?
Yeah, that's a good question. Growing degree days. There are some services, yeah, and really because a lot of the work that was developed in Nebraska, where they've got I think there's all kinds of apps now. Those are based on base 32. So I've used Excel sheets. I believe that the growing degree day tracker from Michigan State, though, has a base 50, but I could be wrong about that. But
no, I think you're right.
And I've got some subscription services I use for it as well. But
What about the rate for quack grass before we move to nutsedge?
Yeah, I wish I had better advice. I don't have, is that depends on which herbicide, but I just don't have a lot of experience. And that weed is, I wish you know, I don't have a lot to add probably in addition to what you already know on quackgrass. Use as high of a rate as you're comfortable with and is labeled, I think would be my advice. And try to, ration that out so that you can make, 2 to 3 applications a year. But I don't want to, I know that's a big problem. I just don't have a lot of advice because there just hasn't been a lot of work done that I'm aware of. So it's about, I think the best we can do right now is to try to take some of the strategies we've learned from some of the perennial weeds and try to apply it to quackgrass. But it's substantially tougher to control, I think, than deer tongue grass, and it also isn't going to, it's going to tolerate the frequent mowing fairly well, so it's not really a choice either. Glyphosate's really good on quackgrass, but unfortunately it's not something we can use a lot of at pine fescue. So I don't have more on that.
Well, that's okay. Let's talk about nutsedge. That's what I
Yeah,
have in my yard.
well, for the last few minutes, I know nutsedge is a big problem in these areas, so I'll try to cover that quickly. I think the most important thing to keep in mind with nutsedge is that you're not necessarily battling the shoots that are above ground, but you're battling these tubers here below ground. These tubers are like seeds in a way, and that they're propagules for that plant to survive, cold temperatures from one year to the next. But they're a little bit more problematic than seeds in some ways. The thing to keep in mind with nutsedge and the tuber production is that day length influences tuber production. So as days get shorter, tuber production increases. But that doesn't mean that the tubers are just produced at the end of the summer. Nutsedge will produce tubers even when days are plenty long, as long as those plants are, mature. And so even beginning 4 to 6 weeks after emergence, which probably means 2 to 3 weeks after you actually see it, those plants are going to begin to produce tubers. And that tuber production is going to intensify as we go through the year. The other complicating factor is tubers, even if they're connected to the plant, the mother plant can actually go dormant after they're mature. So even a systemic herbicide is not going to actually get to that tuber and kill it. So it can, you can have these tubers in the ground for many, many years that remain dormant and are, not going to be controlled by herbicides. So that makes these plants, tricky to control. Density-wise, turfgrass density is going to really reduce the production of those tubers, but in these native areas, I know that's easier said than done. But just a little more on the tubers, because that's kind of really, again, what we're trying to control. Each tuber is interesting because each tuber there has those little areas circled in red are actually the buds on the tuber. So one tuber can contain many buds. Typically what happens is one of these buds will sprout and actually produce a shoot that emerges above the soil. And it'll stay that way unless maybe you spray an herbicide or hand pull it. And then what happens is the plant will actually, the tuber will actually respond to that, and these other buds may actually, germinate, you could say, and emerge. So it's very difficult to control, and those tubers can, remain dormant for many years. There are herbicide options listed here. Don't need to get into them too much. I do mention pyramesulfan or Vexus because it's a new technology. It's a little different from some of the others, and it's a granular that can be applied to wet or dry turf and then watered in whenever rainfall comes, typically, ideally within 48 hours. We've done some work to try to hint or get after this concept that, maybe we need to start making applications for nutsedge control earlier in the season to try to prevent more tuber production. And so what you see on the left is a plot that was dimension applied, which would not have any efficacy on yellow nutsedge, followed by Vexus at a more typical timing in May. So this is when we might start a lot of our nutsedge applications, right? This will be after the nutsedge, though, had actually emerged. Here is a plot where we applied Vexus in March, and then again followed by May, and you can see a lot more control. So this is very preliminary at this point, but I just use it to highlight the concept that, multiple applications are going to be needed, and not getting behind the 8 ball and allowing this plant to produce tubers is going to be really important. And also the value of turf cover in reducing nutsedge competition. This is some good work from Nebraska. So, what happened? All right. So again, we're running out of time, so I'll just leave this here. Rotating modes of action is also important for resistance management. You know, the sulfentrazone type products also have activity on nutsedge. You want to be a little bit careful with those though in fine fescue. All right, so we kind of took our base program, and I guess what I wanted to do is just finish with here's what, you know, a program where you're trying to target some grassy weeds might look like as well, and some of the more problematic weeds. Sorry, I ran out of time on that. But those red areas might be where you'd want to target a segment or fusillate application, potentially a pre-application as well. So I think, Lisa, I think we ran out of time. I was going to talk a little bit about thinning fine fescue, but I think we'll just.
You can go ahead.
Okay. Do we want to do the poll or
Actually,
not? I can probably get this done in 5 minutes.
what I'm gonna do real quick here,
I don't think we need the poll necessarily.
Okay, I'm going to take control of the slides for just a minute, and I'm going to go to this end slide in case there are people who need to exit at this time. We thank everybody for joining us. There's the code 999-235-59-31199. And we will show that again for those people who do not have to exit at this time, but we thank PBI-Gordon and we thank you all for participating. And I will return us back to thinning. There you go, sir.
All right. So we've been doing some work with thinning with indaziflam, which is a pre-emergence herbicide. And I don't think we necessarily need to get into the details and the mechanics of indaziflam unless there's questions. But what I really wanted to do is just talk about how we talked about this in the beginning, but we'd really like to have these areas be thin and a little bit more playable. But, you know, in a lot of these heavier soils, that might actually just lead to, you know, weed control, weed infestations. But again, we have been doing some work with this. Some superintendents have been, I think, experimenting with it potentially. And indaziflam is a pre-emergence herbicide used primarily in warm season turf. It's not used in cool season turf unless, as the label mentions, thinning or removal of a particular grass is desired. So this is kind of some work that shows it basically is more active on roots in sandy soils. So we looked at, could this be used to thin these areas on a golf course? And you know, there's Spectacle, the liquid applied at 10 ounces to the acre on the left, resulted in a fairly thin fescue area compared to the non-treated on the right. We've got some data there basically showing that, you know, we improved the playability a little bit, or actually considerably in these areas where it was thinner. So this was basically a rating of, you know, if I was a golfer, how playable would I consider this lie? But one of the things we found is that, you know, I don't know, you got to be careful, I guess, about where you pursue your thinning, whether it's with indaziflam or some of these, you know, machines that can be used, or clipping removal, that kind of thing, because a lot of times what we found in this work and some of the other work is that whenever you thin that turf grass out, you basically select for weeds that are competitive under poor turf competition and also not necessarily susceptible to that particular herbicide. So we got a lot more quackgrass and yellow nutsedge, we noticed, in plots that had been treated with this herbicide to thin it. So that's something to be careful with. Again, this is still, again, there's a lot more research that needs to be done on this kind of thing. And it's going to be, you know, it's a very experimental thing. We're going to look at other agents this year to actually thin the turf instead of indaziflam. So the idea is, what are some strategies we could use to thin out these fine fescue areas? But I think, you know, you just have to be careful because there's no such thing as a free lunch in terms of thinning. You may select for perennial weeds that now have an advantage, or you may even have certain annual weeds that start to invade. So this is kind of where we're working now, is learning a little bit more about hard fescue tolerance to glyphosate and how does that affect seed head production and that sort of thing. So I think I'm all done, and I'll take any questions if there are any more.
Yes. What
Okay.
effect would controlled burning have on turfgrass density and weed control? When
Yeah.
I was at University of Michigan, golf course burned native areas routinely.
Yeah. So, and that's a good question. It's not something I have a lot of experience with. I do know with some of the fescues, some of them tolerate burning better than others. And I believe my understanding is that it's the hard fescues are maybe a little less tolerant of burning. I don't have good information on that. I mean, it is a good practice. It's practiced a lot to remove, organic matter and that sort of thing. And it should control some of the weed seeds that are, near the surface of the soil, but it might not control a lot of the weeds that are rhizomatous. If those rhizomes are deep enough in the soil that the soil temperatures don't get high enough, it probably won't control nutsedge either. So there's pros and cons. I don't have a lot of information to add, unfortunately, but good question.
Can golf courses do prescribed burns in New Jersey?
No, I don't believe so. I've never seen much of it,
I
but
know Matt Gourlay, CGCSMG, who was at Manhattan, Kansas, at Colbert Hills, they
yeah,
burn routinely.
yeah.
Have to get permits and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's just as far as I know, it's not common in the Northeast, and so that's probably
Mm,
part of my
and
lack
we
of
have
being
a
able to
comment
provide
here
that
that
information.
seemed like the broadleaves were worse after burning, but maybe that was just our location. So I guess there's a
Mhm.
mixed. Um,
Yeah. What could happen too is if you get some thinning that occurs, some of the annual broadleafs, the seed might not be controlled, or it might blow in from other areas. Like thistle seed is if they're a wind-blown seed, that would be an indicator that you maybe controlled the seed that were there, but maybe stuff blew in from other areas after the burning. But yeah, there's not much good information as far as I know on, how does burning affect this particular weed or any of that kind of stuff. Um, it definitely
yeah,
plays a
maybe
part
I
in weed
should
control.
ask Gourlay to do. I'll heckle him about that.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
there's a lot I need to learn in this area. So
what would your approach to red canary grass control and crown vetch be?
I don't have a good answer for that. Um, the crown vetch would probably be controlled by some of the triclopyr things that are more active on trifoliate species. But I can't off the top of my head give you an answer. Sorry.
No, that's okay. We only know what we know, right?
When we get into
Okay,
these
now,
areas, we get all kinds of weeds that not have much experience with. So
okay, and I apologize in advance because I can't say the chemical names. Is clethodim safe to use on fine fescue?
good question. I believe it'd be post. Yeah, I believe it is. It's just I didn't mention it because I just don't hear a lot about it anymore. And I don't know. I don't know if there's a turf product, although in some states you can consider things used in veg management can actually be used in native areas. So I do not know, I guess is the short answer.
Okay. And I appreciate that. And remember, check your label wherever it is that you are. Label is the law. And different states, have a lot of differences, or countries, as it were.
Yeah, I'm sort of getting, my mind is coming back to the clethodim thing. I'm 90% sure there's tolerance. It's something that I've used a little bit here, but I'm not 100% sure. Sorry.
Well, we appreciate your time and energy today, Matt, in providing this information, and appreciate PBI-Gordon arranging for this webinar. They have other upcoming events. Normally I would have a slide, but things have not gone quite as planned today, so I apologize for that. Your education points, again, the code that you will use on the GCSAA website is 999-23559-31199. And if you're listening to this in the recording, put in the day that you listen, not today's original presentation date. And I'm not seeing any further questions. Matt, do you have any other closing remarks for us?
No, I appreciate everybody's time, and I think a lot of the benefit of these is I get to hear about what's going on a little bit, what everybody's having problems with to help, guide our research, because there's just not a lot. There's a lot more that needs to be done looking at these areas. So thanks everybody for your questions and your time, and that's it. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you. As you exit, there is a survey. If you would fill that out for us and also provide ideas. We do have somebody saying we need a burning webinar, and that's one I will get to work on. But if you have other ideas, please let us know. And with that, we're adjourned. Stay well, everybody. Have a great day.